So on behalf of my colleagues at the International Peace Institute, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this meeting in IPI's Humanitarian Affairs series on the challenges of aid delivery in Somalia. And I want to welcome our speakers, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, the Deputy Representative of the Secretary General and Humanitarian Resident Coordinator for Somalia, and Ms. Edem Wosornu, the head of the OCHA office for Somalia, both of whom are based in Mogadishu. And it's really a pleasure also to welcome you back to this platform, Mr. Lazzarini, as you were here in November 2013, 18 months ago. The humanitarian community in Somalia for years has been doing yeoman service in saving and protecting tens of thousands of lives every day. And the humanitarian responders, both from the UN and the broader non-governmental community, face major challenges on a daily basis in providing shelter, nutritional, medical, and other relief services to the large number of refugees and internally displaced affected by the collapse of the Somali state. And we can only really be grateful to you and your many colleagues in the field, both from the UN and not from the UN, outside the UN, for this life-saving mission in one of the most difficult environments in the world. Well, it may seem hard to comprehend for a few of you, but 8 months from now will be a quarter of a century, 25 years, since the Somali state in the form of the government of Siad Barre collapsed in January 1991. 4 years of United Nations-led interventions from 1991 to 1995 ended with the events, although they were in October 1993, known to all of you as Black Hawk Down. So by the summer of 1995, the United Nations had left Somalia. For a dozen years thereafter, from 1995 to 2007, the international community, in the words of former Special Representative of the Secretary General Augustine Mahiga in this very room, said that the international community had virtually abandoned Somalia. Now, there's some debate over that, but I remember vividly his remark along those lines, direct remark. This all began to change in 2007 with the deployment of the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, and at great cost in lives and against all the odds, because if you go back and read what was written in 2007, it wasn't going to work this way. AMISOM forces succeeded, began to turn the situation around, ejecting al-Shabaab from the capital and restoring a degree of order in much of the rest of the country, although al-Shabaab remains a big problem in the south and in northern Kenya. Since 2011, a fledgling transitional federal government in Mogadishu is seeking to provide basic government services, while the 12,000-strong AMISOM mission with troops and police from 6 African countries, supported by the United Nations and the European Union, are providing security in the capital and beyond, and continuing to combat al-Shabaab in the north. So you're all very aware, and a very well-informed audience here, of the consequences of this very prolonged state collapse, which has also spilled over into northern Kenya, most recently with the appalling massacre carried out by al-Shabaab at the University of Garissa near the Somali border. And even more recently, as the humanitarian crisis in the region has crossed the Gulf of Aden, a small number of refugees have arrived from Yemen and Djibouti to seek safety and relief in Somalia. So, as I've already said, many of you here have a lot of experience dealing with this. So we're now going to have presentations from Mr. Lazzarini and Ms. Wosornu for about a half hour. And after that, we're going to have a conversation here. And I'd be interested in any of your ideas about how to move from these immediate challenges to a longer term, finding a longer term, more sustainable future, more viable future, less agonizing future for the people of Somalia and the broader region. So, Mr. Lazzarini, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Hirsch, for the invitation. And looking at the attendance today, I hope this shows that what Special Envoy Mahi Iga said in 2007, it's not the case anymore in 2014. I think today there is certainly some more interest. Let me, my remark today will be very much on, some lesson learned on aid delivery. So I'm not doing a presentation about the overall humanitarian situation, and my colleague Edem will also talk a little bit about that later on. But just in a world where everything is falling apart, or a lot is falling apart, a number of countries are falling apart, the challenges of Somalia are those of a country trying to pull things together. It has fallen apart a long time ago, after 25 years of civil war. But today the real challenges is how to build the future state of Somalia. And this is the reason why the country is now engaged in an extraordinarily ambitious political journey, trying to define what the state should be all about in the future. It's a country where, beside occupation or dictatorship or chaos, has very little reference of what a federal state should be all about. And this is what people in Somalia are talking about. But at the same time, it's a country where, they have to reestablish security in the country. They have to provide assistance, humanitarian assistance to the people in a life-saving situation. They have to rebuild the social contract, which did not exist anymore. We have a multifaceted number of challenges to be addressed in this country. At the time, we are not in a normal post-conflict situation because the conflict is still going on. So part of the country is still in conflict. Other parts are exposed, to armed group. But we are still talking about, a state-building agenda. And I think the challenges of aid delivery have come to a stark and bleak, I would say, a moment 2 weeks ago when, sadly, 4 of our colleagues from UNICEF have been killed following a terrorist attack in Garowe, in a region which we, until the day of the attack, felt it's a region where it's a medium-low risk environment, or at least not an environment similar, to the South Central region. I have to say that talking about the risk environment in Somalia, there have been since 2008 13 UN staff which have been killed, and during my stay, in fact, in Somalia, 7 UN staff have been killed, and tens of other bystanders have been killed when the United Nations was targeted in the country. Despite that, I'm talking about aid delivery of the United Nations. We have in a country over 800 national and international staff working in Somalia, from Kismayo, Mogadishu, up to Hargeisa. And overall, we have 1,400 staff working in or on Somalia, the rest 500 being in Nairobi, but flying quite a lot into the country. I would say, despite this extensive presence in the country, and despite the involvement of the international community, our aid delivery in the country is regularly questioned. Some of you might have seen the comment of the president last week when basically he was talking about the failure of the international community to properly scale up its assistance to Somalia, and it was echoed by the president of Puntland, whose words were much harsher, than the one of the president of Somalia, I will not repeat what he said, but you can easily find it in this newspaper. So this difficult reality, marked by increasing security threat and political tension around aid delivery, will be a little bit the field conductor of my intervention today. Maybe let's start with some lesson in terms of aid delivery. And as Ambassador Hirsch say, I think it's an understatement to remind that Somalia is one of the most difficult contexts to deliver any type of assistance in the country, and it has been the case, for the last 2 decades. Since 2012, with the setting up of the federal government, there have been a kind of a new momentum, which has been translated into this mutual commitment that we are calling, the New Deal and the Compact of the government. We are committed, to support this new momentum, even if old challenges or new challenges are appearing in the country. The challenges of the international that we, as members of the international community, face in Somalia, on the surface, are very well known. There is a conflict, there is insecurity, we have almost no, institution or weak institution, there is political fragmentation, we have proxies, regional intervention in the country, and possibly also in the future, impact of a conflict in a neighboring country, like it is the case in Yemen, and it's also a country prone, to repeated natural disaster. And given that the country had a long, I would say, history of intervention in the 90s and later on by other members of the international community, whether the intervention comes from the military or the academic people. By the way, I was quite surprised when I went to the first time to Somalia to find out the wealth of detailed knowledge number of our colleagues had about the reality of the clan, the sub-clan, the sub-clan in Somalia. But despite, I would say, all this presence, we can say that there is quite a lot of claimed knowledge. But I think we have to be careful with this and possibly try to handle with this kind of issue with a slightly more humility when we pretend, to know Somalia. First, we all know it's a very complex and fluid situation, and we have to admit that we will never completely, grasp all that. All reality, trying to explain why something is happening in a country. And we have to reckon that our knowledge on Somalia, can be fable to some extent. And the second point is, because we have a long history of engagement in the country, the Somali usually remember extraordinarily well, our promises, but they also remember extraordinarily well our broken commitment. And basically, when an aid worker, operate, we had cases of a tension we had to deal with for issue of broken promises, which could have taken place 5 up to 10 years before vis-à-vis a certain number of Somalis. So that's also something, we need to learn. And I think the statement we had from the Vice President last week reminded us how quick they are to demonstrate when they are not happy with us. So what does this mean for delivery in Somalia? I think, number one, I think the Somalis have extraordinary assets. I'm always amazed to see, the wealth of competencies, the number of people from the diaspora, extraordinarily well-educated, coming back in the country. And we have also many times said that the resilience of the Somali has been extraordinary, and certainly one of the reasons why, they have survive, this 25 years of chaos and ordeal. Having said that, I would caution sometimes this extreme resilience has also a count. How do you say? Yeah, exactly. I think that this resilience contribute partly to perpetuate some suffering in the country. There is an extraordinary way, to deal with violence, with death, an extraordinary way, to forget few minutes later what happened before, which I do believe is sometimes, also a key for repeating, things we would like to put an end. Another lesson when it comes to delivery is, when you deliver political advice, institutional development, humanitarian assistance, whether we like it or not, we cannot do it in a remote way. We have done it for 20, 25 years, but there is, limit to that, and that's one of the reasons why, being in Nairobi was not a solution anymore, and this is the reason why we have the political, mission in Mogadishu, but we have also the decision-making of the agency funds and program now being, in country also in Mogadishu. And we also need to make sure that commitment have to be made, communicated in realistic way. You might remember in Brussels, we were talking about $2.1 billion assistance to the country. There were high expectations from the federal government that this is new money. It has not been properly communicated, and that's one of the reasons why there is also sometimes resentment vis-à-vis what's being said and what the reality is all about. What are the lessons? What this lesson mean? For the United Nations in country. Above all, right now in Somalia, there is an urgent need for much clearer, more honest dialogue in a certain number of area. And I think that the UN has to take the lead to make sure that this dialogue is really taking place. Number one, the issue of the severity of the humanitarian crisis and critical access to people in need of assistance. Edem will talk about this, but the UN has to make sure that constant attention is given, adequate funding, as well as continuous upgrade to our ability to analyze and to anticipate what's going on is a role we have to play. But we have also to learn some lesson about the fact that we deal with humanitarian crisis now for 2 decades in a recurrent way, chronic way, and we in a country where we have one of the most worst human development indicator. Clearly, we haven't, in 20 years of intervention in the country, addressed any of the root causes. So there is a need, to link this discussion between humanitarian and development. I do believe that we have a new opportunity today, especially since 2012, where we tried to put in place an environment conducive for this kind of discussion, an environment where we are talking about state building and humanitarian response cannot be implemented in isolation of this broader agenda. Then we need also to lead discussion about, the real risk on the ground. I think we have to respond to this difficult question of the trade-off between our duty of care vis-à-vis the staff, but also our duty to deliver a mandate is an extraordinary, difficult balance to find. And each time we have a new incident, we really question, the balance that we have agreed before, because there is also a risk of not assisting. There is a risk of assisting in a wrong way, but definitely it's a kind of country where we have to be aware of any type of risk, but the risk of the duty of the safety of our staff needs to be absolutely key. There is also, and we have initiated this discussion with the donors, a discussion about the cost of delivering. Delivering in Somalia is much more expensive than delivering in any traditional post-conflict situation. There is no the one-size-fits-all in terms of a cost in a context like Somalia does not fit at all. And this is the reason why we have also engaged with the donors way to accept that there is a premium, to be paid if we want to deliver a program in the country. But it's not just for the safety of the staff. You have also a premium to develop, a certain number of risk management tool in order to have also a better grasp on the risk of diversion or the risk of not doing business. There is one thing I keep telling donors: we have to be careful that if we accept that resources be given to better deliver to the UN, not to be tempted to dump the risk to other partners, to NGOs who would be less regarding the risk, or any other, I would say, partners implementing a program. Of course, we have also other type of risk. We have this trade-off between the expectation that we deliver rapidly, but in the other hand, we do business differently in the country, and we want the ownership of the authorities. It's difficult to have the ownership of the Somalis in the implementation if at the same time we want rapid delivery. There is also a trade-off, to put in place. I think one of the main risks, but I mentioned already before also, is always this discrepancy between what we say and what the reality. It's a context in Somalia where, the more you are precise on your capacity of delivering, the more, you will have, partners behind you. Having said that, here there is a real issue. We are all committed. When I say all, it's the international community, the United Nations, through a new deal with the Somali government and the Somali to do business differently, to promote the Somali ownership, the Somali priorities when it comes to implement a program. Unfortunately, the reality is still uneven within the UN agencies, but also within the international community. We have developed a way to do business over the last 20 years. We have a comfort zone in the way we have done business, and despite our commitment to act differently, we are tempted and continue to be tempted to do business as we did. I give you just one example. For those who are familiar with the New Deal and its coordination architecture put in place, the architecture put in place is called the Somali Development Reconstruction Facilities. We have agreed collectively that decision on program be taken through this mechanism. We have pool funding put in place with the World Bank and the United Nations, but as of today, only 10% of the funds committed in Brussels are decided in terms of supporting national priorities through this mechanism, which means that all the other money for the time being disbursed in the context of Somalia continue to be decided outside this commitment we collectively had in country. And this is also an indication how difficult doing business is in the country. Let me, because I know you wanted me to give a lot of time for the discussion, maybe to skip one or two things, but just to let you know that as a United Nations, and even if not all the agency funds and programs are yet behind this, we are fully committed to promote this national ownership. We have developed what we call an integrated strategic framework in response to the priority of the government. We have put in place a pool funding to support joint programming, which are totally owned by the government. But despite that, it does not mean yet that all the programs of the UN are behind, the national priority. But we are aiming at that. I'm quite optimistic that we will be able to do this in the near future. Despite some of the progresses I just mentioned right now, there are new risks of aid delivery which are looming in the country. I think on the humanitarian side, the effort we had last year have certainly contributed, to avert or contributed to prevent the country to slide down into a much bigger humanitarian crisis. You might recall that a year ago we were warning the international community that the indicators are as bad as they were before the 2011 famine. I would say there have been a conjunction of element or event which has helped us, to address the situation. Having said that, today the number Edem will share with you are still extraordinarily high, but because we have averted, the worst case scenario in 2014, and because there are so many competing, crises in the world, it is becoming extraordinarily difficult to find funding, for the operation in Somalia. And of course, if we cannot, respond to the most basic need in the country, we take also the risk to undermine, the broader peace and state building effort in the country, and we take the risk, to undermine, the political and security gain of the last year. There is another risk I just wanted to flag, which I alluded, I suggested a little bit before, is the temptation to transfer number of activities of the agency fund and program to the INGOs or private partners. Now, obviously, it's not a risk to transfer to INGOs, and if donors decide after a while to go to the INGOs, agency funds and programs should also ask themselves, why this? How come I lost a comparative advantage I might have had, a few years ago, and I do not have today? This is not the risk I wanted to flag. The risk I wanted to flag is we have to make sure that the shift from the agency funds and program to the INGOs are based only on efficiency and are not based to the fact that donors or member states do not want, to cover, some of the cost related, to the safety of the staff, just because some partners might not have, I would say, the same level of safety on the ground. So that's, what happened here for the time being. I just also remind when it comes to private companies, I asked my colleague when I was in New York this week if there are many other countries where, we observe a privatization of aid delivery, but I just want to say that there is a risk of dumping the cost if we use private companies. I don't know to which extent this can be sustainable. The United Nations is present in Somalia for more than 40, 50 years. We had a number of setbacks. The last setback has been 2 weeks ago when we lost our 4 colleagues. But we also know that as an institution, we will be there, for the next coming few decades. I'm not 100% sure that this will be the case. It would be the case for a private company. So let's just conclude with what you might have heard a few times. We have declared, we have many times said 2015 should be the year of federalism and delivery. It is true that in 2015 there have been a number of political delivery in the country, especially when we look at the state formation and the discussion, related to the future shape of the state have started at the leadership level. But when it comes to delivery of the agencies, fund and program, we have no more money available in 2015 than we had in 2014 or in 2013. So what this year of delivery means for us, that means the year of better delivery, of better ownership, from the Somalis, better focused, better targeted, and in line with what the Somali are deciding in the country. Our success, again, based on what was said before, will very much depend on how we address the issue of having an environment conducive for our operation. I keep telling colleagues we have to reverse some of the pressure agency funds and program and INGOs had on the shoulder to deliver at any cost and just to shift into the country. We are not in a situation comparable to South Sudan at the time agencies and INGOs were going back to Juba. We are still talking about terrorist threat. We are still talking about repeated attack in the country. And we have, to reverse the pressure by saying it's not a question of deadline, it's a question of make sure that the environment allow us to have a sustainable response, for the population in Somalia. So, Ambassador, I think I will stop here. There are many elements I haven't covered yet, but I'm conscious of the time. Thank you.
Wonderful. First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Lazzarini. I also want to acknowledge Ambassador Douale, the permanent representative of Somalia, who's with us here today, who's a great friend of IPI. I think I've seen you at every single one of our meetings on Somalia, and a great representative of your country. So I'm very grateful that you are here today. I have a lot of thoughts in my mind from your very excellent presentation. But let's hear now from Ms. Wosornu, and then I'll offer one or two thoughts and open a discussion. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hirsch. Maybe just to complement what the humanitarian coordinator has mentioned in terms of challenges of aid delivery, I'll start with the numbers for the humanitarian response. Humanitarians love to talk about numbers. Somalia is a food deficit country. At any given point in time, we have 50% of what the country needs is what the farmers are able to produce. So starting with that, you always hear about food insecurity in Somalia. It's and the whole issue of malnutrition. A few numbers. Over 3 million people in Somalia are currently in need of humanitarian assistance. The last sort of population estimate survey said we had 12.102 million people in Somalia. So a quarter of the people of Somalia need some sort of food assistance or livelihood support. 731 of this 3 million need daily assistance to be able to survive. 2.3 million are on the verge of sort of slipping back into some sort of crisis or being stressed. Of this number, 203,000 children are acutely malnourished, and some 40,000 are severely malnourished. And everybody who knows this context knows that a severely malnourished child requires medical interventions to be able to survive. Displacement, you've heard the numbers. Over 1 million people displaced within the country and over 1 million refugees in the sub-region. So in Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, etc. We also have the issue of the Yemen crisis impacting our fragile situation, which is of concern. And then we have the statements that have been made recently on the Somalis in Kenya. So a bit of a tension there. Health. Somalia has no basic health services, so the health system is significantly stretched by the UN and its partners. We have many cases of measles, we have numbers of, we were able to move, we had a polio sort of crisis in Somalia 2 years ago, and now there's no polio anymore because of massive interventions. Child protection, we have issues related to violations of children's rights. 1,899 grave violations were reported last year alone. Everybody who talks about Somalia often says, how are you able to sustain a response? As the humanitarian coordinator said, 25 years, Ambassador Hirsch said it. We're almost 25 years, a quarter of a century into delivering aid into Somalia. How do you sustain this response? It's magic. I think it's constantly reminding everybody about the need to sustain the attention on Somalia. And I believe, Philippe, I'll steal your words when you said to the member states last October, don't let Somalia become an L3, because that's a new buzzword. Don't let us slip into becoming an L3, because then you'll have to divert resources from other places. Just sustain the response, the humanitarian response, the development response, the political response. Make sure these three strands are together. Humanitarian funding. I was trying to figure out what kind of money we've been talking about when you talk about Somalia and the response over the last 5 years, 2011, 12, 13, 14, and currently. We asked for $800 million for the 2011 appeal. That was before famine struck, and we raised the tempo from $800 million to $1.3 billion. Of the $1.3 billion, we were able to raise $1.1 billion. That is significant, 2011. In 2012, we raised 65% of the appeal. That was about 1.1 billion. We raised 65% of that. In 2013, we raised 55% of that, what we asked for. And in 2014, we raised 51% of the 933 million we asked for through the humanitarian appeal, through the financial tracking system. This shows that people care about Somalia. This shows that the donor community, member states, Somalis, because we have a huge issue on remittances coming through into the country. People care about Somalia. The key challenge is to sustain that response, is to sustain attention on it. I think as a humanitarian, people often say, why do you talk about the New Deal? Why do you talk about other frameworks? But as, maybe echoing again what Philippe said, we can't do things in isolation anymore. Humanitarian response has to be cognizant of what is the ship. A member state told me humanitarian action is done in isolation with your principles, and how is it that the ship is sailing and you're not part of it? We are part of it. We are contributing to peace consolidation in a country, and we are not doing things in isolation of what's going on. The New Deal framework has 5 peace and state building goals. The humanitarian appeal has 3 strategic objectives. We've had presentations about how they support each other. This is important, complementary. In terms of maybe one quick key point, again, being conscious of time, and then, of course, having the chance to ask questions, etc. Journalists, again, constantly ask Philippe, you about what are we doing differently in Somalia? You've been here for 25 years. What is changing? A lot is changing. The way we do humanitarian response in Somalia is changing. Looking at, the lessons from the famine response, those of you who will recall, a real-time evaluation kind of hammered all of us and saying that we need to do things differently, we need to take a different turn, and we've done that. Again, I think leveraging on your position as resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator and making sure the linkages are there. Philippe, the system, you forced us to talk to each other, because that's what has to happen. You cannot have, water trucking every year on the riverbank, in the areas of drought. You have to think about borehole drilling at some point, because every year you'll be there water trucking in September in Johar without fail. And this is what we tell the donors. We need to look at some sort of sustainability when you look at the response in Somalia. Have we responded to the early warning by early action? Yes. Sometimes we stall because of funding or because of our ability to find ways of accessing certain populations. Have we been able to be more strict and more sort of cohesive on joint planning and analysis? Absolutely. Have we strengthened our coordination structures and processes? Cumbersome as they are, yes, we have. We've tried and we continue to. And I think the latest Brookings Institution report talking about, these reports are quite critical of the system sometimes. So it was nice to see some progress on how we've worked together with the government. We've worked together with partners such as Turkey, Qatar, UAE in doing things differently. We've strengthened our coordination system. With a lot of uphill struggle, I think we were able to get Philippe, you kind of just went for it. So we're able to get the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in our humanitarian country team. This is not something that is standard. It's not an IASC system. We said we have an HCT plus, and that worked for us. Have we been able to, working with communities, doing things differently, the whole issue of cash transfers, food vouchers, resilience building, communities, and looking at the IDP situation through, looking at the IDP problem through a development lens rather than a humanitarian lens. We've tried to do that. And then finally, the issues that you spoke about on the whole issue of accountability, risk, etc. Have we been innovative? Yes. You can't talk about humanitarian response without principles. Are we respecting the principles that were established 50 years ago? Absolutely. Have we found creative ways of delivering aid in Somalia? Yes. Have we been criticized for taking, sort of vaccines and boxes of assistance in a helicopter that is not humanitarian to a location that has recently been opened up? Yes, we have. Because that the 30,000 children there have not been assisted. That they haven't received polio vaccination. So why wait and count them? We took the assistance there. We found creative ways of delivering aid in Somalia without breaching or disrespecting the principles or derogating from the principles. Will we be doing the same business 25 years from now? Hopefully not. With the changes that we've done, with the new deal framework, with having sure making sure there's a platform in place for humanitarians to contribute to, I don't think we'll be doing the same thing in the next 25 years. I hope we'll sort of continue to help Somalia out of its crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate both of your presentations. I very much, first of all, like the emphasis you had on humility and on not expecting the outside world to solve Somalia's problems. And I can remember Ambassador Robert Oakley, my colleague who passed away earlier this year and who led the American mission there in 1991. And I remember my discussion with him that only the Somalis can solve Somalia's problems. And you've been very clear about that, too, that whatever understanding we may think we have, it's finite. It's, this is not a country where you can just come in and try to do things for people there. I'm also really struck by your discussion about the 25 years and about the long term. And I kind of want to ask you one or two things. When the American government tends to work only a year at a time, we don't have a budget in the United States, and supposedly the budget is decided on an annualized basis. So most countries, presumably European countries, presumably work on short-term budget processes. So I wonder how you work on a longer-term vision when most of the countries are working on short-term visions. And approaches. And then I want to ask you to say something about that in just a moment. Then the recipients of all this aid, is this, one generation after another that are refugees? Are these IDPs or refugees that are going to remain in those circumstances over 25 or 30 years? What does the future hold for all these children now? If you think about Palestine or Syria or Yemen, these are long-term crises where people are still, refugees in camps, yes, in Syria and Lebanon for generations. So I'd be interested in what you have to say about that. And so what is the community, the outside world, supposed to regard as the prospect for delivering all this aid? What does that portend for the country, in other words? So I wonder if you want to say, because I thought the long term, most people in Washington when I was there only could barely get to the weekend. More barely. I'm making fun of that, but I think it's true. Very hard. And most presidents only get through the 4 years of their term, après-moi, you know, and so on. Somebody else's problem. But you're talking about long-term. So I wonder if the two of you would say something, and then I'll just open this up. You want to comment?
Yeah, thank you. No, I won't comment to the U.S. budget and your yearly, or no, that you can function without a budget, which is inconceivable for an European, but this is something else. In the context of Somalia, we have a new deal. It was signed and agreed in 2013, and it was supposed to lead us, to the end of 2016. I have to say that most of the commitment, most of the contribution, most of the donors have a multi-year approach with a framework of 3 to 5 years, and basically can already, through the strategy, tell us what the contribution will be up to 2016. So we have a predictability of, I would say, longer term and development fund in general. It does not mean that every donor will be able to share this information with the same level of assertiveness. But this links to the next question on the IDPs. Let's be clear. I went to Somalia in 2005, described to colleagues the IDP settlement. We were there already in the 90s. Basically, we were describing exactly the same. Then we are in 2013-14. We are still talking about the same when we talk about IDP settlement. So except some, I would say, pilot cases which have been led in Bosaso, in Geza, in Garowe or Galkayo, fundamentally, the IDP issue has been looked at only through a humanitarian lens. Basically, trying to respond to the most urgent need to the people, but never looking at addressing, the longer-term solution of the IDPs. So yes, of course, if you do the same every year and everything is predictable, you will have the same situation 20 years later, and the next generation will be exactly in the same shape. What we need, is to look at promoting, a durable solution, to look at the IDP issue through, I would say, more a livelihood lens, which means a multi-year approach. And this is the reason why, this conversation between development and humanitarian partner is so important. There are so many different areas where this conversation has to take place. Building safety net for the people, the so-called resilience agenda, durable solution for the IDP. The health sector, you cannot do, just primary health sector and have something sustainable, while the primary health sector was just funded for 20 years through humanitarian funds. The primary education, the same. For 20 years, you had a number of initiatives, coming from the humanitarian partners, but without, longer-term strategy. So this conversation, needs to take place. What's very interesting is that while obviously it's quite uneven already within the UN system, within, the practitioner, but you have the same type of resistance sometimes coming from the donor, themselves, where we realize that humanitarian practitioner within, the donor do not talk, to the development practitioner. So we have to bridge, to break, this silo. There is no doubt. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, John. Ramis Rowe from IPI. Thank you both for your remarks and from bringing us news from the ground. I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail on how the situation in Yemen is affecting your work on a day-to-day basis. Ms. Wosornu, you mentioned it briefly. I was wondering if you could go into a little more depth on this. Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to take one more. And just, when these new crises erupt, how does that affect your situation? In other words, every day when the newspaper were hit with a new crisis somewhere, is that changing the way you can function, funding, and so on? Madame, you want to identify yourself, please?
Aisa Fernandez Taranco, UNDESA. I just wanted to keep the. I have a question regarding trying to keep the bridge humanitarian and development. And I have just this quick question in terms of on a scale from 1 to 5, where will you put institutional capacity building and also regional integration as sub-regional integration as a way to have a bridge between humanitarian and development in Somalia?
And finally, and the gentleman there in the fourth row, just stand up and tell everybody who you are and so on.
Hi, Philippe de UN Habitats. Over the 25 years, Somalia developed a very strong war economy, as happens in these kind of crises. And I wanted to know, which was affecting, stifling economic development, but also heavily affecting aid delivery. And if you could point out, since the New Deal, what have been the main elements to kind of turn that around? And for me, it relates to a second point question on the importance of local ownership to complement national ownership, which in a place like Somalia, where the concept of state is quite different than we would traditionally imagine. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Lazzarini, you want to answer those, and then yourself?
Okay, well, I will comment on some of the questions. I don't pretend to have a final answer. Just on Yemen, maybe two or three comments. Number one, the number, you have 1 million Somali in Yemen. So among them, 250,000 refugees, more or less, and the rest are migrants. So we were used to have a road, from Somalia to Yemen. Now, with the conflict in Yemen, for the first time, there have been a kind of a reversed, a trend, and a few thousand people, came back. For the time being, the numbers are limited. We are talking about 3,000 to 4,000 people who have come back, primarily in Berbera and in Bosaso, in the north of the country. Now, all will depend, obviously, on how the situation in Yemen will evolve. And I have to say that for the government, it is becoming a kind of a national security nightmare if they start to think about the worst case scenario. Because basically they are saying we need only a few hundreds or 1,000 or 2,000, Somali joining, armed forces in Yemen, possibly including in Al-Qaeda affiliated on the Al-Qaeda affiliated armed forces having control in Yemen. And if they come back, obviously this will be an additional risk to the traditional, Al-Shabaab they have in the country. Now, on the overall humanitarian response, it's not Yemen per se, but the multiplication of the crisis has clearly impacted our ability, to fund properly, the humanitarian response. And we see it this year. We have averted, the worst case scenario in 2014. That means it's good enough to divert money somewhere else. And right now, we are hardly 10-15% funded, and we are already 4 months into the year. We might not have grasped everything, but still, the funding level is bad enough for a number of agencies, to put an end to some life-saving operation in the country. When it comes, to capacity building is absolutely central in the New Deal framework. It's not a pillar per se because it's encompassing basically every sector. The World Bank and the UN have an important program, not only for the federal institution and the region, but also, to support the emergence, of new states. What's the impact of the sub-region for the time being? I don't know what you had in mind, if it is a neighboring country with a sub-region. We do not have yet a model à la South Sudan, where we had hundreds of civil servants from Kenya going to Somalia. What we have for the time being is number of talented Somali from the diaspora who are back in Mogadishu, but unfortunately not in enough number for the time being. On the war economy, obviously it's a complex subject. The only thing I want to flag here is that over the last 3-4 years, the country team has developed a quite robust risk management instrument, risk management framework. We have worked also hand in hand with the World Bank and the African Development Bank. What was put in place for the humanitarian community at the time the resolution of the Security Council asked us to be accountable for the delivery of aid and to make sure that it does not end in the end of the Al-Shabaab. That's when we have started with risk management. I'm quite pleased to say that today, I mean, we have a pretty good understanding on where our money and delivery is going in the country. We have a much better control of, I mean, the financial risk, the fiduciary risk in the country, and this is certainly also a way, I mean, to contribute to put an end, I mean, to what was a kind of a war economy or monopolistic position of some former warlord. But it does not mean that they are not still benefiting, but it has become much more complicated.
Just to add on the numbers of Yemeni returnees, people returning from Yemen, I think the numbers are not a lot, as Philippe said, but let's not forget that we had 60,000 Somalis deported from Saudi Arabia last year, between April and December last year, and the system was able to absorb it. IOM's registration in Mogadishu upon arrival and basically supporting them to assimilate into society. Everyone talks about how the system cannot take a massive return of refugees from wherever, Kenya, Yemen, and other neighboring countries. But in terms of voluntary returns, or in the case of what happened last year, deportees, the collective system is able to support. And again, back on the resilience of Somalis, on the issue of how families sharing whatever they have, on the issue of the amount of assistance going into Somalia. One example is 100,000 people receive food every day in Mogadishu. And that's a lot. I mean, these are the figures that don't come to bear. So somebody arriving, going to Mogadishu, not in the best circumstances, will have some food. What we cannot absorb is a massive return. That's a point I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. William Verdone from African Views. I recall in 1985, a song, We Are the World, was very popular. It came out, and I believe a lot of money was raised, and of course, it was for humanitarian purposes. That was 30 years ago, and everything seems to be at a standstill. You know, now you mentioned the monumental challenges. Do you see any resolutions 3, 5, 8 years down the road for some of these specific challenges that you addressed before? Thank you.
And if I can sort of, my question was not only about money, but about governments thinking ahead. You know, how far forward, realistically or desirably, do you think the countries of the European Union or the United States or Latin America can sort of think into the next phase of what's going to be happening in Somalia? That's kind of beyond money. So Maureen, and then Lami here.
Yeah, hi, Maureen Quinn, International Peace Institute. I wanted to go back a little bit more and follow up on Philippe's question, and you had talked about national ownership. Is that in the context of Somalia, I mean, you've got the political process ongoing related to the constitution, federalism, but you have South Central, Somaliland, Puntland. I mean, there must be, disagreements. And so, what is national ownership, and how are you making or reaching out to make that work so you can, work under the principles and framework of the New Deal? Thanks.
And Lami here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. Lami Kroma with International Peace Institute. Two questions. At the beginning of your presentation, you informed us of all the international staff that have passed away in Somalia over the years. But can you please share the number of AU forces that have passed away as well? And on that point as well, you mentioned innovation, working with non-traditional humanitarian delivery actors. What are the experiences, both good and bad, you've had with working with the African Union peacekeepers, Amazon in particular, in carrying out your mandate? What have been the opportunities? What have been the risk? Thank you.
You okay?
Yeah. We're here to answer questions.
You're doing a great job.
Or to comment on question. I think I started the presentation by saying that there is a huge difference between Somalia and all the other countries, especially the one falling apart. Somalia is really dealing today with all the challenges of a country trying to put things together. So there are, extraordinary challenges. Starting about how do we want to live together? How do we want to share power? How do we want to share the resources? These are all questions, related to federalism. We had, before 2012, a transitional government. In 2012, we had a federal government which was selected. But for each of the phases, we broaden the legitimacy of the selection, of the parliamentaries or of the government. We expect in 2016, that there will be a form of next phase, which shows that gradually, things are going in a given direction. 2 years ago, no one believed in the formation of the Jubaland. I'm not saying it's completed. They have extraordinary, challenges. The same for the central region. And now we are talking, the same for ISWA. But now we are talking about, the initiation of the process for the central region. We talk about the initiation of the process for Iran and Middle Shabelle. And once this is completed, which they are still hopeful it will take place by the end of the year, we will be able, the Somalis will be able to start to address, the much tougher, question. It won't be easy. But I think one of the lessons also for us is when we talk about peace and state building, peace means reconciliation, means healing after 25 years, plus what happened before. It cannot be done in 2 years. I think we have to be extraordinarily conscious on the time. If you force and give a deadline saying, well, peace has been built after 2 years, that's a total recipe for failure. But I have to say that for what we observe, despite all the differences, politicking, going on in Mogadishu or elsewhere, there is still fundamentally a genuine, desire to have dialogue and to try to address this difficult question in a context where institutions are extraordinarily weak and they do not even have, a proper, army or proper police. So all this needs to be built at the same time. Now, what does it mean, Somali ownership? Well, we are careful not to say Somalia government only ownership. We talk about Somali ownership. And I have to say that in the context of the New Deal, we have spent about, since Brussels till the end of 2014, so 14 months, spending our time in process, getting the architecture right, making sure that in the decision-making within the New Deal on priorities, that the region are fully on board. That was not a given at the beginning, because obviously anyone had the interpretation of who should decide for whom. But today it's a total given. The region are fully on board. Of course, more needs to be done. Of course, a few months ago, there was no real proper dialogue between Mogadishu and the region. But now, since the new government is in place, you have what we call a leadership forum, where the president of the region, the president of the in Mogadishu, the prime minister, speaker, can meet on a regular basis and start to address difficult questions. So this takes time. These are processes, but at least, issues which, few years, 1 year or 2 years ago, we were very far to think that this would be possible, is taking place. The EU number, I don't have the EU number, but it's very high. It's very, very high. That we need also to pay a tribute, to the country having contributed. They have paid a very high price over, the last few years. They came as a military people. There were a number of offensive, and they have paid. They have registered a lot of loss. I'm sorry to say, but I would not put it in comparison with civilian civil servant who are going to build the country, or people coming into the country, to contribute to military operation. The acceptance of the exposure is slightly different, and despite the fact that AMISOM has paid extraordinary price and people have lost their life, I still believe that the INGOs and the agency funds and program, and even if the number cannot be compared, have also paid an extraordinary high price. For the type of work, they are expected to do. If you are a development practitioner, normally you don't expect, to be in the middle of a military operation. There is a lot of good in the collaboration. With AMISOM. A lot of good in coordinating the access in the newly accessible area. We have worked on planning. We have advocated for the access road in South Central, asking AMISOM, to give priorities to the road. The humanitarian partners need to use to reach population in need of assistance. We have been able, to initiate, proper dialogue on human rights issues, on sexual violence issues, proper dialogue with our colleague on the ground, following the report which was issued by the Human Rights Watch. Here I'm talking about, the dialogue on the ground, and I have to say that there is an openness and a readiness, to find a solution, to very complex situation, and to engage with civilian partner.
Thank you. On experiences with Turkey and the non-traditional multilateral actors, I think we've seen an evolution of our collaboration with them. We started with trying to bring everything under the traditional UN NGO umbrella, the IASC system, to where we are now, where we recognize what they do and collectively exchange information. I'll give you some practical examples very quickly. We had sort of 20,000 metric tons of food coming in from Turkey. This is to, maybe scores of thousands of people. We worked together with the government and the Turkish authorities to ensure that we were complementing. We were not putting assistance in the same areas. The Turks also do humanitarian development concurrently, and their experiences in Somalia, from building roads and hospitals to deliver, giving food assistance to the government, is something that we've learned from. In 2011, we really tried to bring the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and their partners under our umbrella. These days, we work with them, we coordinate, we share the same platforms, etc. So some real practical examples. Ambassador Hirsch, your point on government and funding. We have a lot of money coming in from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, at least pledges, an interest through IGAD, and through the sub-regional systems. So this is something that I think the platform we were talking about, humanitarian development linkages, when we had our first meeting chaired by the HC or RC in that sense, on IDPs, for example, or resilience, we found that the World Bank is planning to do a lot. We found that the Islamic Development Bank is planning to do a lot. So how do we tap into all these resources in the region, not just looking at the traditional donor lenses? Thanks.
So I want to just ask both of you one last question, and then we'll wrap this up. I also really appreciated your tribute to the African Union forces, which have, as you said, taken an incredible price here. You made a really interesting point in your remarks here, which is that where a number of other countries are falling apart, you said that Somalia is sort of coming back together. So I wonder if you want to offer just a brief reflection on what, I don't really like lessons learned, but what is that experience, what do you attribute that to, the coming together again after a long period of falling apart, that might be relevant to other countries, Libya, the most obvious example maybe, that are falling apart? I mean, what is it that's making it come back together again? I thought that was a very interesting contrast that you drew here.
Somalia is still what we keep saying, despite the adversity of the environment, despite the fact that there's still military activity going on and there's still confrontation, we still believe that there is a positive narrative in the making. And that's the reason. But now, what is the reason behind it? It's a very good question. One might say, well, I mean, it's one country which will be in charge of its own destiny. 25 years of chaos, of ashes. Maybe the time, I mean, the duration might be a factor. We have also a very active diaspora, which is very much related and close, to the country. And I have to say that this was quite vibrant and remarkable when in 2012 the federal government was put in place. At the same time, there have been 100 of people of the diaspora coming back in Mogadishu. And for those who have been in Mogadishu, it's quite a different city today than it was in 2008, the last time when I saw Mogadishu. You have even a traffic jam, you have a traffic light, you have you have a vibrant businesses. I remember I saw all the taxi company arriving in Mogadishu. One day I saw a taxi company. 3 months later, I could identify 6 different taxi companies. So they still believe, despite the fact, and this is something which is concerning, and I commented before. The Somalis are so resilient that they have the tendency, to act or to behave or to become far too fatalist, and to accept the unacceptable to be repeated and repeated. And I give you just one example in Mogadishu. You might recall there have been, number one, the civil servant and diaspora are targets, for the Al-Shabaab activities. An hotel start to be primary target because that's the places where they are living. You have 30 dead in an hotel. A week later, the other hotel were also accommodating, civil servant and diaspora is target of an attack. No measure have been put in place because, well, that's the way it goes. So there are no real, lesson, and I hope that this in the future will change. But to answer your question, why in Somalia and not elsewhere, Libya might be far too soon. Here we talk about 25 years. We're not talking about 3 years.